Halloween, autumn, spooky season. It's a time when we all really want to engage with horror stuff, gothic stuff, or Halloween themed stuff like Tim Burton films. But I do that pretty much all the time. And I did read a lot of spooky stuff, a lot of gothic stuff, and I'll talk about it. But I've also had a kind of hankering to read historical fiction. Autumn seems like the time for historical fiction. But despite my best efforts, because I had loads of review copies in this month, I actually only read one historical novel, but it might be my favourite novel of this whole year. Next month I'm going to focus more on historical fiction though. And even though I reviewed quite a few books this month, I actually had even more review copies that I didn't manage to get to, and I'm kind of annoyed at myself. But I'll try and get to those next month as well. Also, this month I didn't read as much as I wanted to because I spent the first week of this month moving into this new place, and it took multiple trips back and forth in a car and then a van between London and Glasgow. And if you don't know how far that is, it's like 7 to 8 hours each way. And it sucked, but I still managed to read about 15 books this month, which is pretty good going considering how stressed and kind of sad I've been, but it was all worth it. I love living here. This is the best city. It's awesome. Before I jump into what I've been reading though, check out my new tattoo. This is very fresh, I only got it 2 days ago. And this was done by an artist named Lily, who goes by Needle Mistress, and she works out of Gateshead in the north of England. And I think she did a bang up job. More literary tattoos. I'm going to start at the end with the very last thing I read and talked about this month in my last video, which was the 1818 text of Frankenstein. That video took a lot of research. It kind of burned me out a little bit. I read the 1818 text, I did loads and loads of online research. The book is also full of interesting essays and excerpts and poems and diary entries and loads of context surrounding the creation of Frankenstein. And since Frankenstein is my favourite book, it was a lot of fun, but it also was really exhausting and showed that, as I said in the video, I'm not really cut out for academia. It was too much. But reading the original text of my favourite novel, when up until very recently I didn't even know it existed, was an awful lot of fun and really satisfying. And honestly now I do prefer the 1818 text. And there's a frustration to that because it's not the popular one. It's not the one that you read. If you pick up a random beautiful old edition of Frankenstein or a brand new publication of it, whatever, it's not going to be the 1818 text, it'll be the 1831 text, and that kind of bugs me. But if you haven't watched that video, I put my heart and soul into it, so go check it out. Now I'm going to run through some of the horror novels that I read to kind of christen this year's spooky season, and the first one I read was Sister, Maiden, Monster by Lucy A. Snyder, an absolutely disgusting piece of fiction that I absolutely adored. It really made me feel uncomfortable a lot of the time. In that video I talked about how I struggle with health anxiety, and the book is full of people with tumours and references to various diseases and cancers, and it's set during a pandemic. It's not an easy read if you're freaked out by body horror stuff. But what I find interesting about my own psychology when it comes to all of this is that yes, I have health/illness anxiety. I really fear getting sick, but I do love body horror. I read a lot of it. I play a lot of video games with grotesque body horror. I love Cronenberg films, despite their lack of plot and the fact that they're actually sometimes quite boring, except for The Fly. The Fly is great. So I love body horror. I love bodies being torn up into pieces or transforming into grotesque things. I love all of that. But this book has all of that while injecting it with a disease-focused plot. And that just tripped me up a lot, but not enough to make me stop reading it. And that's the thing about me, and I'm saying this is probably a very privileged thing. There are definitely things that trigger me. And I go into stories sometimes knowing the trigger warnings, and I still jump in and I still usually have a good time. So I don't often avoid the things that trigger me. I read them or watch them anyway. If I get upset, that's on me, that was my choice. Now, some people obviously have had such terrible experiences in their lives that they can't bear to come in contact with anything that triggers them because of PTSD. For me, I just get kind of uncomfortable, maybe a bit sad, maybe a bit anxious, but I'll cope. So I went into this book regardless, and it was a struggle, but I think it was worth it because it was a really disgusting horror novel that I really enjoyed, in spite of all the things that frightened me and freaked me out. Then I read The Boatman's Daughter by Andy Davidson, and this turned out to be a fascinating book. A real piece of American Southern Gothic that was written with some of the most beautiful, evocative, poetic language I've ever read, especially in a Gothic novel or a horror novel. Like classic works of Gothic fiction from the 19th century absolutely have some of the most beautiful language, again to reference Frankenstein. Stunningly written, but modern Gothic books don't often carry that same poeticism in their language. Some do, and The Boatman's Daughter is absolutely one of them. An incredibly satisfying book to read in terms of how it makes you feel. The language sets a very specific tone. It leans into surrealism a lot of the time, and it's really beautiful. The Boatman's Daughter starts with a young girl who goes out on a little job with her dad, who is a boatman on a bayou in the American South. This particular job has him carrying a local witch, who also works as a midwife and other things, to the local priest's house because the priest's wife is about to go into labor. Weird, terrifying stuff happens. The baby is born deformed and scary looking, and the priest tries to kill it and thinks he has killed it, but he actually hasn't. And then the boatman goes missing, and we follow his daughter 10 years later from that point on, where she's taken up her dad's job and she's secretly living with the witch and the child. And the child is now about 10 years old and is covered in scales and webbed hands and feet, and it's bonkers and beautiful and surreal and gothic, and I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm definitely going to check out more of his stuff. In the comments of that video, a few people recommended his other novels, and I am absolutely going to read them soon. Then we have The Grip of It, which unfortunately, a month after reading it, hasn't really stuck with me in a way that I had hoped. It's another literary horror novel. It's a haunted house story set in the present day about a couple who move out of the city into the country, into a house in a very, very small, secluded, quiet town, and they live at the end of a street. They have one neighbour, and he's a bit weird, and he seems to be up in their business. And the house itself is behaving strangely. Rooms seem to disappear, walls move around, there are crawl spaces that open up and then close. You cannot trust the geometry and the geography of this house. And it's trippy, and it's the house itself haunting the couple. But a month later, I have to admit, I don't really care. I'm really interested to see what Jac Jemc also does, and other things she has written, and this is the only one that I've read so far. But I liked it enough to check out more of her stuff, but yeah, it hasn't stuck with me in the way that I hoped it would, because it is a very beautiful, literary, kind of horror thriller. It was alright. It was okay. After reading those books, I kind of had to shelf horror and thrillers and the gothic for a second to focus on a few review copies. And this is one that I actually didn't do a full video review of, but I did do a short review of it. This is something I'm going to try out occasionally when I don't have enough to say to make or warrant a full review. I'll do a few short reviews. I'm a big, huge music fan, and I follow The Needle Drop on YouTube, Anthony Fantano, big, huge music critic YouTuber, and he started doing short reviews of albums that don't warrant a full one, and I'm copying that. I'm going to start doing that. That's not to say that The Delivery by Margarita Garcia Robayo didn't warrant a full review. I was just worried that I wasn't really clever enough to talk about it for 5+ minutes. I felt like it was a book that overwhelmed me and washed over me a little bit, and it really hit me hard. I related to it in many ways. And then when it came down to it, I finished it and thought, I don't really know what to say. So I thought, okay, I'll do a little minute-long review. Now, this book was translated from Spanish by Megan McDowell, and it was published by Charco Press. Very good friends of mine. I love what they do. I talk about them a lot. I've read one of her books before, Holiday Heart, and back when I did written reviews for booksandbow.com, I did a written review, and I really liked that book, and The Delivery is even better. It tells the story of a woman who was born in the Caribbean, now lives in Buenos Aires, and is looking to move again to the Netherlands soon. She moves around a lot. She's kind of nomadic in a slow way, and I used to be that too. I really relate to that. All through my 20s, I didn't sit still. I was always looking for the next place to live and work and experience things. So I immediately understood. I understood even more when the book was about the way that our families haunt us and the things we take with us, because she's in contact with her sister, the two of them video chat occasionally, and her sister sends her care packages. But one day, her sister sends her a massive crate, and she's not even going to open it. She just thinks, oh, I don't care. Whatever's in it, I don't need it. I'm moving soon. I'm just going to throw it away. Before she has the chance to do that, the crate opens itself up, and inside is her mother, who has been sent to her in a cargo crate, and then proceeds to just live with her and kind of haunt her as a living, breathing person. It's a really great book. It's a really quick read. I read it in a day, maybe two, and it's about a lot of different things, but I found myself massively relating to it as a nomadic person, or formerly nomadic, and someone who's had a lot of family issues and scars when it comes to my relationship to my family. Yeah, I really, really related to this one. However, I did do a full review of The Premonition by Banana Yoshimoto, which was translated by Asa Yoneda from Japanese into English. I love Banana Yoshimoto, and I loved this just as much as I love all of her works. Although, as I said in my video, Goodbye Tsugumi is still my favourite book of hers. The Premonition is a really short book. It's a 100-page novella that tells the story of a young teenage girl who lives with her parents in Tokyo, and she has an aunt that she really looks up to who lives a very hedonistic life by herself as a music teacher outside Tokyo, and she often goes to visit this aunt. But our protagonist also has gaps in her memory, things that she misremembers or can't remember at all, and one visit to her aunt unveils and releases all of these memories that have been hidden. And suddenly her whole childhood up until this point gets reframed, and it's really interesting and really satisfying. Go check out my review if you want to know more. Then we have Brainwyrms by Alison Rumfitt, the brand new second novel from one of the best horror writers of today. Now, I think all of you know how much I love her writing. I loved the short story that was included in Peach Pit. Her debut novel, Tell Me I'm Worthless, was my favourite book of the year it came out, 2021, I think. And Brainwyrms lived up to the legacy that she's starting to carve out for herself. It's incredible. I don't love the review that I did because it's a book that is so close to me in so many ways, thematically and politically. So it was kind of tough to detach myself from it and do a critical job, but I tried my best. But instead of talking about the book at all, I'm just going to say, go check out my review and also check out Eerie, which is a limited series podcast that I was listening to while driving to get my tattoo the other day. Eerie is a podcast of 8 episodes, each one half an hour long, and each one is a short horror story written by a different author. Sometimes the authors read them out themselves, and sometimes they don't. Kirsty Logan and Julia Armfield both have stories in there, and so does Alison Rumfitt, and she narrates hers herself. And that story, which is called Leech Dog, is the most upsetting, distressing, offensive thing I have ever read/listened to in my entire life. Absolutely the most horrible horror story. Mostly for its ending. The ending is the most shocking and disgusting thing you'll ever read/listen to. I was upset, and it's incredible. When I say it upset me, that's a good thing. It's horror, but it is truly distressing. It's the only one in the podcast that gets trigger warnings at the start of it, because that's what Alison Rumfitt does. She's punk and she likes to shock people. So go listen to Eerie and listen to Leech Dog if you can stomach it. The podcaster gives trigger warnings for self-harm and animal abuse, and you need to take those very seriously. I also did a formal review of Luda by Grant Morrison. I talked in the review about how Morrison is my favourite comic book writer. I'm a huge fan of everything they've ever written, and I've been reading their comics since I was about 18 when I got into comics myself. Grant Morrison is a legend of comic books, and over the age of 60, they have finally written their first ever prose novel. When I did my review, I talked about how a few days from the time of recording, I was going to go see Frankie Boyle, the comedian, interview Grant Morrison on stage to talk about the book. And I did that, and it was really, really fun. And in fact, at the end, there was kind of a Q&A thing that Frankie Boyle jokingly turned into an agony aunt session, and he asked, what issues do you have, blah, blah, blah. I stuck my hand up and I asked a serious question about the book because I might have been the only person there who'd actually read it because I had a review copy. So I asked a question about the book, Morrison answered it, that was really cool, and then Frankie Boyle said, do you have any problems that we can agony aunt for you? And I made a joke about how my tits hurt because they're growing, because I'm on estrogen, and I got a wave of whoops and cheers from the audience for just talking about being trans, and that was really cool, so thank you, Glasgow. The talk was incredible, though. It was not about the book. They did not bring up Luda at all, really. It was just Morrison being philosophically and politically weird, while Frankie Boyle did his best to keep everything a little bit grounded by talking about literature a little bit. But it was a great night. I loved it. My final formal review that I did in October was of Death Valley by Melissa Broder. And I said in that review that I love her books. I've done videos on The Pisces and Milk Fed, and now we have Death Valley, her third novel, which I personally think is her weakest book. But that feels pretty harsh to say because it's definitely her most personal book as well. This is a book that clearly came straight from the heart, from her own personal experiences, her own recent traumas. So I feel really bad saying that I just didn't like it as much as her other two. In fact, I remain a massive fan of hers, but her books have not gotten progressively worse. But I've liked them progressively less. The Pisces is still my favourite, Milk Fed a little bit less, and Death Valley a bit less than that. But it's still a great book because she's still a great writer. It's a very, very trippy thing about a woman who's in her early 40s. Her dad is sick in hospital. He might die. They're not really sure at this point. She lives in Los Angeles. They all do. And so she goes out into the desert, into this nowhere place to do some hiking trails and stay in a hotel and research her new novel. That's kind of her excuse, but really she's just trying to get away from the overwhelming emotional strain of all of this. While she's out there doing all these hiking trails, weird stuff happens. She encounters a lot of really surreal stuff. The first half of the book is very grounded, second half is basically a long trip or a fever dream. And I just didn't really like that second half very much, but the context of the book is really great. No issue with that at all. But as she veers more into surreal territory, she kind of lost me. And not because I don't like surrealism, I really do. I'm just not sure she's that good at it. But Death Valley is still worth a read. If you're a fan of Broder, you won't be too disappointed. I wasn't. I'm still glad I read it. And I think about it a lot. Two of the books that I read I don't have on me because they were audiobooks. I read 1.5 of the Lord of the Rings books. I said at the start of this video that my partner and I took frequent drives back and forth between Scotland and London to try and get all of our stuff sorted, and it was a nightmare, it was stressful, we cried, we got angry, it was not fun. But so many drives back and forth that cost so much money and so much time did allow us to read The Fellowship of the Ring on audiobook, narrated by Andy Serkis, and he's incredible, and a decent chunk of The Two Towers as well. So I'd never read Lord of the Rings before, now I've read half of the trilogy, 1.5 books. Not bad. The book that I mentioned at the beginning, which might be my favourite of 2023, is The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore. Blakemore's Manningtree Witches is one of my favourite historical novels of all time, and The Glutton is, I think, even better. It's an incredible story about a real guy who actually existed around the time of the French Revolution, who's born in a small village in Lyon. We watch him grow up and get abused, and we see the day he's born, and it's darkly hilarious. I talk about all of this in my video. Once he's kind of kicked out of his village, he realizes that he has this bottomless hunger. He's this scrawny little thing who will eat anything and never feel satisfied. And apparently, this was all true. He went to Paris and he did sort of street performances. Later he joined the army. He saw the revolution from the inside in Paris, and you see all of this in the book, and it's absolutely beautiful. Please go check out my video. I love this book so much. I want that video to do well because I want people to read The Glutton. It's incredible, and it might end up being my favourite book of the year. I'm not sure yet. Definitely top 3. My patrons recently voted on a book for me to reread, and the winner of that poll was Dracula by Bram Stoker, and I thought, okay, I'll leave that till October and I'll read it then, and that's what I did. I reread Dracula, I did a video on it, and there's a lot in that video that I already don't like. There were analyses of that book that were a little bit too paper thin, and I could have gone into them in a lot more detail, especially the queer readings of Dracula. I also did a TikTok video that went a little bit viral, especially on Instagram, and a lot of very stupid people who are afraid to read into a book or use any kind of critical thinking skills at all hated the fact that I mentioned that Dracula is excessively queer. But anyone with a brain who has critical thinking skills and isn't afraid of us will know that I'm right. But I do wish I'd talked about that more in the main video. Also, while I was making the video, I kind of asked myself the question, is Dracula actually gothic? Because there are a lot of elements that I consider part of the traditional Gothic theme, context, setting, whatever, that are missing from Dracula. And that got me thinking, is it actually Gothic? And I kind of asked myself that question in the video, edited it while still thinking about that and going, yeah, that's good, yeah. A few days pass and I go, what the fuck was I talking about? Dracula is an excessively Gothic book. It is a classic of the genre for a reason. And I kind of regret asking the question, is Dracula really Gothic? Because yes, in so many ways, yes, of course it is. It just also, in the reread, felt way more like an adventure story than I'd remembered it being. It's claustrophobic, and an important element of the Gothic is claustrophobia, is a space feeling like a character in and of itself. The house, the castle, whatever it might be. And Dracula has that, but it also doesn't. It has it at times, while also flitting around here and there and going on adventures and lacking that atmosphere. Because it's a horror adventure. And I also mentioned in the video that the characters are a little too, I don't know, cheerful and likable, and they band together through friendship and camaraderie and love, and that doesn't feel very Gothic. But given all of that, I was still being pretty naive about what exactly makes the Gothic, and I'm annoyed at myself because the Gothic means the world to me. It's my favourite genre of anything. But I'm kind of glad I asked the questions, and I take my videos very seriously. I love my job, I love what I do, I think I'm a good critic, and I feel like I let myself down there, but I'm also glad that I asked the question because asking questions is good. Anyway, that's enough of a ramble. Check out that video if you haven't, but it might annoy you. And finally, I have gotten back into Batman comics. I've moved around a lot in my life, as I've talked about. I've lived in multiple different countries, and I used to be entirely nomadic, just living out of a suitcase, and now I finally feel like I have a home base. This is my space now, so I feel like I no longer have to constantly be getting rid of books, swapping them out, selling them, giving them to charity, whatever. And so it's time for me to rebuild or build a new comic book collection. And since Batman is my favourite, and I don't know what Batman has been up to for the past 6, 7, maybe 8 years, I found a local independent comic book shop. I chatted with the guy in there who's a real sweetheart and really knows his stuff, and I started picking up Batman again. I read both Batman and Detective Comics. There are always 2 Batman comics running in tandem, and that's these 2. These are 2 pretty new volumes. Batman, written by James Tynion IV, and I've read his stuff before. He's fantastic. He's so good at what he does, and he leans into the horror of everything. He's written horror comics, and he often adds a bit of a scary twist to everything he writes, and Batman suits horror. There are loads of scary Batman stories. And then, through Detective Comics, I discovered the writer-artist team of Mariko Tamaki and Dan Mora. She's an incredible writer. He's an amazing artist. Absolutely bang-up job. This is The Neighbourhood, and it's a fantastic 6-issue arc that runs alongside this, The Cowardly Lot, and both of them lead to something called Fear State, where Scarecrow is going to take over Gotham City. And I'm really, really excited to read that next. I'm so glad that I'm back into Batman comics. I love him to bits. I'll probably do a few videos in the future about Batman, even though I did a video about comics the other day, and it absolutely tanked and no one gave a shit about it. I can't blame you for that. Watch whatever you want to watch. It's just sad. I was hoping to do more comic-related stuff, and if people don't want to watch it, I won't make it. But I do love Batman, and that might overrule that, and I might just make some Batman-related content because I want to. We'll see. Anyway, me and Batman are friends again. And I'm really, really happy about that. There you go. I think that's everything I read in October. 2 audiobooks, 2 comics, a bunch of review copies, 2 books that I reread, but one was slightly different, rediscovering my love for my favourite novel, and I got a new literary tattoo. And I moved to Scotland. Not a bad month. In November, as you'll see in my next video, I'm going to be reading more historical fiction, and I also have more books to review. All in all, this has been a good month. The move was intensely stressful, but it was worth it, just as I knew it would be. I love Scotland. The city of Glasgow has been absolutely incredible, so kind to me so far. I've loved what I've experienced, the places I've been, the things I've seen, and I only just got here. I think this afternoon I might take another trip to Glasgow's queer bookshop. Category is books. That's an amazing place. Anyway, I'm very happy I'm here. I'm happy I did a decent amount of reading this month, and I hope you enjoyed. You can support me on Patreon if you'd like to. And subscribe for books.